The submarine is called U-954. It left Kiel, Germany on its first war patrol in April 1943. On board, 49 men, most of them in their late teens and early 20s. The commander is 23 years old. He is trained for this for 2 years. His crew trusts him. They have no reason not to. On May 19, 1943, U-954 is located by a British aircraft in the North Atlantic. A consolidated Liberator from Royal Air Force Coastal Command spots it on the surface, running on diesel to recharge its batteries. The aircraft drops 4 depth charges in a tight pattern around the conning tower. The explosions bracket the hull. U-954 begins to flood immediately. It never surfaces again. All 49 men die. Among those 49 men is Peter Dönitz, 21 years old, the son of Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man who commands the entire German submarine fleet. Admiral Dönitz learns of his son's death in the same weekly casualty report that lists dozens of other U-boats lost that month. He does not leave his post. He does not reduce operations. He keeps sending submarines into the Atlantic. Because at this point, the losses are so catastrophic that one more death, even his own son, changes nothing about the mathematics. In May 1943 alone, the German Navy loses 41 U-boats, 41 submarines in 31 days, roughly one every 18 hours. Entire crews of 40 to 50 men, gone. No bodies recovered, no wreckage visible from the surface, just a position marked on a chart and a name added to a casualty list. The men being lost are not abstractions. They are young men from Hamburg and Bremen and Munich and small villages whose names appear only once in the historical record. They went through the same training program, learned the same procedures, passed the same tests. They boarded their submarines with the same expectation of returning that every sailor carries onto a ship. Most of them did not return. The men being lost are not unique to May 1943. This pattern repeats every month throughout the year. January, February, March, April. Each month, the casualty reports at Lorient and Brest and Saint-Nazaire grow longer. Each month, berths in port that should hold returning submarines stay empty. The men who do return watch the berths and count. They do not talk about it, but they count. This video is not about heroism. It is not about strategy or the political decisions that put these men in the Atlantic. It is about one question, answered as precisely as the historical record allows. If you were a 20-year-old German sailor assigned to a U-boat in 1943, what were your actual chances of coming home alive? The answer is not what most people expect. Over the entire war, from September 1939 to May 1945, the German Navy commissioned approximately 1,162 U-boats into active service. Of those, 863 were lost during combat operations or to accident. That is a loss rate of 74% of all submarines that entered service. Nearly 3 out of every 4 boats did not survive. The total number of men who served in U-boats during the war was approximately 40,000. Of those, approximately 28,000 died, a fatality rate of roughly 70%. Read that figure carefully. 7 out of every 10 men who served in U-boats did not survive the war. That number has no parallel in any other branch of any military on any side of the conflict. For comparison, the fatality rate for American bomber crews in the 8th Air Force, which sustained its own catastrophic losses and is remembered as one of the most dangerous assignments of the war, was approximately 26%. The fatality rate for British infantry across the entire war was around 12%. German army soldiers on the Eastern Front the most lethal ground campaign in military history, suffered a fatality rate of approximately 35%. U-boat crews lost men at twice the rate of German soldiers fighting in Russia. The losses were not evenly distributed across the war. In 1940, the German submarine force loses 22 boats. In 1941, 35. In 1942, 87. These numbers are serious, but submarines are still being built faster than they are being destroyed, and the Atlantic convoy routes are suffering heavily. The U-boat force believes it is winning the campaign. The losses were not evenly distributed across the war. In 1940, the German submarine force loses 22 boats. In 1941, 35. In 1942, 87. These numbers are serious, but submarines are still being built faster than they are being destroyed, and the Atlantic convoy routes are suffering heavily. The U-boat force believes it is winning. Then 1943 arrives. In that single year, the German Navy loses 237 U-boats in 12 months. That is nearly 3 times the losses of 1942. The month of May 1943 alone accounts for 41 of those losses. Admiral Dönitz later calls it Black May. He withdraws the majority of his submarines from the North Atlantic shortly after, not because the strategic objective has been abandoned, because the loss rate has made sustained operations in that theater operationally impossible to justify by any rational calculus. To understand the survival numbers, you need to understand what a U-boat actually was as a physical environment, because the space itself was part of what killed people, separate from any enemy weapon. The most common German submarine of the war was the Type 6C. Length 220 feet, beam 20 feet at the widest point. Displacement when submerged 871 tons. Crew typically 44 to 52 men. Hold those numbers together. 220 feet long, 50 men inside. That is roughly the length of 2 semi-trucks placed end to end.
Inside that space, 50 men ate, slept, worked, used the toilet, stored 3 weeks of food and all their equipment, and operated a weapons system capable of sinking a 30,000-ton merchant vessel. There were no private spaces on a Type 5 OIC. There were no individual bunks for most of the crew. The standard arrangement was called hot bunking. When one man finished his watch shift, he took the bunk vacated by the man starting his watch. The bunk was still warm from the previous occupant. 14 torpedoes were stored in the forward torpedo room, the largest objects on the boat. Crew members slept between them, on top of them, and around them. As torpedoes were fired on patrol, the space they occupied became marginally more livable. Until then, the forward torpedo room was simultaneously a weapons magazine, sleeping quarters, and workspace. The atmosphere inside a submerged U-boat was the single most immediate physical threat to the crew, apart from enemy action. A Type 6C carried enough battery capacity to run submerged for approximately 80 hours at slow speed, considerably less at higher speeds. During that entire period, the crew was breathing the same air. Carbon dioxide levels rose steadily as the hours passed. At low concentrations, crew members experienced headaches and reduced cognitive function. At higher concentrations, decision-making became impaired in ways the men themselves often could not detect. Reaction time slowed. Judgment degraded without the person experiencing that degradation being aware of it. Condensation covered every interior surface continuously. The temperature differential between the cold ocean water outside and the combined body heat of 50 men inside produced constant moisture. Clothing never fully dried. Surfaces were perpetually damp. Fungal infections were common on long patrols. In operations in tropical waters, heat inside the pressure hull reached temperatures that made sustained physical work nearly impossible. This was the environment in which men had to make accurate decisions under depth charge attack, in degraded air. After days without proper sleep, in complete darkness because all non-essential electrical systems were shut down to conserve battery power and reduce the acoustic signature that the enemy sonar was trying to track. U-boats were destroyed by 4 primary means: aircraft attack, surface ship depth charges, direct gunfire or ramming at the surface, and mines. Each produced different conditions inside the boat and different survival implications for the crew. Aircraft attack was the fastest death and, by 1943, the most common cause of U-boat loss. An attack on a surfaced submarine typically lasted less than 30 seconds from the moment the aircraft was spotted, assuming the crew spotted it at all. The standard attack used depth charges set to detonate between 25 and 50 feet of depth. If a charge detonated within approximately 20 feet of the pressure hull, the shock wave was sufficient to rupture welds or crack the hull directly. Water entered at high pressure. The boat sank. In most documented aircraft sinking incidents, the average number of survivors was between 0 and 3 out of a crew of 50. Water temperature in the North Atlantic ran between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius. Without a survival suit, unconsciousness from hypothermia occurred within 30 to 60 minutes. A depth charge attack from a surface escort vessel was a fundamentally different experience. Once a British destroyer had a submarine contact on ASDIC sonar, it prosecuted the attack in repeated runs. Each run, the ship dropped a pattern of charges at the estimated depth of the submarine. Then it circled, regained sonar contact, and attacked again. An engagement could last hours.
Inside the U-boat, a depth charge containing 300 pounds of Torpex explosive, detonating at close range, produced a shock wave through water that struck the pressure hull with force dependent entirely on distance. At 50 yards, survivable but violent. At 20 yards, frequently fatal. The physical effects, lights failing, instruments breaking loose, cork insulation fragmenting and filling the air with dust, pipes fracturing and spraying water, men thrown from their positions. The waiting was worse than the charges themselves. Between patterns, you had time to think, and thinking was the worst thing you could do. You counted the seconds. You tried to calculate how close the last one was. You listened to the flooding if there was flooding. And then you heard the screws of the destroyer coming back overhead. Otto Kretschmer, commander of U-99, captured March 1941 from British Naval Intelligence interrogation records. When the hull failed, survival depended entirely on depth. At shallow depths, under 100 feet, a hull breach was survivable in some cases. Men near the conning tower might escape before the boat filled. At depths greater than 200 feet, a hull failure was not survivable. Water pressure at 200 feet is approximately 90 pounds per square inch. Flooding was essentially instantaneous. Most U-boats sunk at depth left no survivors and no recoverable wreckage. Families received a notification that the vessel was overdue and presumed lost. The collapse of U-boat effectiveness in 1943 was not a gradual deterioration. It was a series of specific technological developments that arrived in a compressed period and collectively destroyed the tactical advantages the submarine force had relied on since 1939. Each innovation closed one of the gaps that had allowed U-boats to operate. U-boats communicated with their command in Germany by high-frequency radio. They communicated frequently.
Admiral Dönitz's Wolfpack tactics required submarines to report convoy sightings and coordinate attack positions. The British had developed high-frequency direction finding, known as HFDUF, which could take a precise bearing on a radio transmission. By 1942, HFDUF equipment was being fitted to escort vessels. 2 ships could triangulate a position accurate enough to direct an aircraft or surface vessel. A U-boat that transmitted a sighting report could have an aircraft overhead within 90 minutes. The Wolfpack tactic required communication to function. Communication was now giving the Allies a location fix in near real time.
U-boats recharged their batteries by running diesel engines on the surface, primarily at night. Aircraft could not see a surfaced submarine at night without illumination, and using a searchlight announced the aircraft's approach in time for the submarine to dive. In early 1943, British patrol aircraft began carrying centimetric radar operating on a 10-centimeter wavelength. German submarines had been fitted with a radar warning receiver called METOX, which detected the previous generation of Allied radar and gave the crew time to dive. METOX could not detect centimetric wavelengths. U-boat crews surfacing at night to charge batteries were now being found by aircraft they had no way of knowing were there. For many crews, the first indication of an aircraft's presence was the sound of depth charges entering the water above them. The Hedgehog addressed the critical flaw in depth charge attacks from surface vessels. The standard depth charge required a ship to pass directly over the submarine and drop charges as it crossed overhead. During that approach run, the ship lost its ASDIC sonar contact because the equipment could not track a target directly below. The submarine commander had roughly 30 seconds during each attack run when the ship above had lost accurate contact and could not adjust its aim. The Hedgehog was a forward-throwing weapon that projected a pattern of 24 contact-fused projectiles ahead of the attacking ship. Because the ship fired forward, it maintained ASDIC contact throughout the entire attack. A detonation confirmed a hit. No detonation meant a miss, but crucially, no explosion also meant no warning to the crew below that an attack had been made at all. In 1940 and 1941, German submarine technology and tactics led. By mid-1943, Allied countermeasures had closed every gap simultaneously. The U-boat force was fighting with methods designed for a threat environment that no longer existed. The aggregate statistics are one way to understand the losses. Another is to work through what the numbers meant for a single crew on a single patrol in the summer of 1943. Because that is the scale at which these men actually experienced the war. A U-boat departing on patrol in June 1943 was one of approximately 60 to 70 submarines at sea in the North Atlantic at any given time. In that same month, the Allied anti-submarine forces destroy approximately 20 U-boats. The monthly loss rate as a percentage of boats actively on patrol is therefore between 25 and 30% per month. A standard North Atlantic patrol lasted between 4 and 8 weeks. If a crew departed in early June and returned in mid-July, it had spent roughly 6 weeks in an environment with a monthly attrition rate approaching 30%. The probability of surviving that single patrol was approximately 65 to 70%. Now extend that calculation across a full tour of duty. A crew that survived one patrol was assigned to another. The standard rotation for a U-boat crew in active service was 4 to 6 patrols before crew rest, reassignment, or command rotation. Some experienced commanders completed more. Many crews completed far fewer.
The mathematics of repeated independent probabilities produce results that are straightforward and brutal. If the probability of surviving a single patrol is 70%, the probability of surviving 2 consecutive patrols is 70% multiplied by 70%, which equals 49%. 3 patrols, 34%. 4 patrols, 24%. 5 patrols, approximately 17%. 6 patrols, 12%. A crew completing 5 North Atlantic patrols in the second half of 1943 had, statistically, roughly a 1 in 6 chance of all members being alive at the end. These calculations use averaged figures. Individual patrols varied considerably based on area, timing, convoy traffic, and escort composition. A boat assigned to a quiet sector in a slow week faced meaningfully lower odds of contact than one routed directly into a heavily defended convoy route. But the aggregate numbers are real. They are derived from documented losses, and they produce these outcomes when applied consistently. The average age of a U-boat crewman who died in 1943 was 22 years old.
Commanders were typically between 24 and 28. Enlisted crew ranged mostly from 17 to 25. These were not experienced career servicemen. They were young men who had joined the Navy in 1940 or 1941, passed through an accelerated training pipeline, and been assigned to submarines because the U-boat arm was expanding rapidly and required large numbers of personnel in a short period of time. By 1943, the accelerated training meant that replacement crews had less preparation for what they were being sent into than the men who had gone before them. Not all crews died. Approximately 30% of U-boat crewmen survived the war. That is roughly 12,000 men out of 40,000 who serve.
Understanding what differentiated the surviving 30% from the 70% who did not is both historically relevant and clarifying about the nature of survival in that environment. The single most significant variable in U-boat crew survival was the experience of the commanding officer. Experienced commanders had developed instincts through repeated patrols that less experienced officers had not had time to acquire. They had learned the characteristic sound patterns of ASDIC sonar pings and could sometimes estimate from the ping intervals how accurately an attacking vessel had their position. They knew which evasive maneuvers were effective, when to go deeper, when to maintain depth, when to run silent, and when the threat had genuinely moved on versus when it was repositioning for another attack run. Statistical analysis of documented U-boat losses confirms this clearly. Boats commanded by officers on their first or second patrol had loss rates significantly higher than boats commanded by veterans with 4 or more patrols of experience. The gap was large enough to be a dominant factor in survival probability. By 1943, however, the experienced commanders were dying faster than they could be replaced. Boats were being sent on patrols with commanders who, in the standards of 1941, would not yet have been cleared for independent command. Assignment area also mattered, though crew members had no control over it. The North Atlantic convoy routes were the most heavily defended waters on Earth by mid-1943. Aircraft coverage was nearly complete. Surface escort groups were experienced and operating in coordinated hunter-killer formations. Other patrol areas, including the South Atlantic and waters around southern Africa, had lower concentrations of anti-submarine forces and lower loss rates. A crew sent to the North Atlantic in the summer of 1943 received that assignment from command level with no input from the men executing the patrol.
I have thought about this my whole life. Why did I survive when the men I trained with did not? I was not a better sailor than they were. I was not more careful. I was not smarter. I was luckier. That is the only honest answer I have been able to give. Eric Topp, U-boat ace with 35 confirmed kills, from a 1993 interview. He survived the war and died in 2005 at the age of 96. At the loss rates that prevailed in 1943, individual skill and experience mattered at the margin. The margin existed, but it was not wide enough to reliably separate the living from the dead across a full tour of operational service. The approximately 12,000 U-boat men who survived the war did not return to the world they had left. They came home to a Germany that had been physically destroyed during the years they had been at sea. The cities around the major naval bases, Hamburg, Bremen, Kiel, had been targeted by Allied strategic bombing throughout 1943 and 1944. Large sections of those cities no longer existed. Streets that appeared on maps these men had memorized before deployment were rubble. Buildings they had grown up in were gone. Some men returned to find that their families had not survived the bombing. The strategic air campaign that U-boat crews had been fighting to disrupt by attacking the supply convoys carrying fuel and materials to Britain had, from those same British bases, reached back into Germany and killed the people the sailors had been trying to protect. That specific reversal appears in survivor accounts often enough to be a recognizable pattern. Men who had been captured, primarily those whose boats had been forced to surface by damage and whose crews had been taken prisoner by British, Canadian, or American forces,
spent the remainder of the war in camps in Britain, Canada, and the United States. Treatment was generally consistent with the Geneva Convention. Several thousand U-boat prisoners were held in camps in Canada, described by survivors as strict and cold but not deliberately brutal. They ate, they were housed, they waited. Some were still in camps when the men who had stayed at sea finally came home. The long-term psychological consequences for survivors were extensive and almost entirely unacknowledged. The clinical framework for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist as a recognized category in 1945. Veterans who returned with persistent anxiety, severe sleep disruption, intrusive memories, and inability to function in ordinary civilian environments were told to put the war behind them. The war was finished. Recover and resume your life. Herbert Werner, whose memoir remains the most detailed first-person account of U-boat service across the entire conflict, describes attending reunions and counting the faces that were not there. The men he had trained with, the men he had served alongside, men whose names he knew, but who appear nowhere in official histories. His memoir was published in 1969, 24 years after the war ended. The length of time between the events and the ability to write about them is itself a form of evidence about what it takes to process them. If you entered the U-boat service with a group of men you trained alongside, and 70% of that group did not survive, the weight of that survival does not resolve on a schedule. We began with a question. If you were a 20-year-old German sailor assigned to a U-boat in 1943, what were your actual chances of coming home alive? The historical record allows a reasonably precise answer. If you were assigned to a North Atlantic patrol in the summer or fall of 1943, your probability of surviving that single patrol was approximately 65 to 70%. If you completed that patrol and were assigned to a second one, your cumulative survival probability dropped to roughly 45 to 50%. A third patrol, around 30 to 35%. A fourth, around 20 to 25%. Most crews in active North Atlantic service in 1943 did not complete 4 patrols. Many did not complete 2. The overall U-boat service fatality rate for the entire war was 70%. In the North Atlantic specifically, in the second half of 1943, the rate for any given patrol period was higher than that annual average. The worst months produced loss rates that, extrapolated across a standard tour of duty, made survival the statistical exception rather than the norm. These numbers do not carry a political valuation. The U-boat campaign killed approximately 30,000 Allied merchant sailors and naval personnel over the course of the war. The men doing the killing were themselves being killed at a rate that exceeded almost every other category of combatant in the entire conflict, on any side. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The Battle of the Atlantic was decided not by courage or the absence of it. It was decided by production capacity, by intelligence, by the specific sequence of technological innovations that arrived on the Allied side in 1943 and broke the tactical framework the U-boat force had been built around. Germany could not counter them quickly enough. The U-boat force kept operating after May 1943, but it was operating in conditions where the fundamental methods it had relied on since 1939 no longer functioned. The men inside the submarines did not control any of those variables. They controlled how well they performed their jobs. They controlled their response when the depth charges began falling and the hull started leaking and the air started failing and the destroyer above had not moved on. They did not control whether they lived or died. By 1943, the outcome of a patrol had largely been determined before the boat ever left port. The men aboard it simply did not know which outcome they were going to get.